Welcome to Critical Edges podcast. In this podcast, we explore critical edges that may seem distant and marginal at first glance, but which are in fact very much connected to and even interdependent with our global society and politics. In our podcast, we discuss with different scholars who have one way or the other addressed critical edges critically.
For the past few decades, Indigenous studies and Indigenous activism have significantly enriched both scholarly and civil society understandings of colonization and the genuine pursuit of decolonization, justice, and solidarity. Today on the Critical Edges podcast, we are honored to welcome Rauna Kuokkanen, or Fierenjot Kirste Radna, a distinguished Sami scholar from Otsejohka, or Utsjoki in Finnish, who has extensively studied the intersectional struggles of indigenous peoples in the Northern Hemisphere.
Rauna Kuokkanen is a research professor of Arctic indigenous politics at the University of Lapland and an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Her research delves into comparative indigenous politics and law, indigenous feminism and gender, Sami governance, and settler colonialism in the Nordic countries. Rauna is a member of the Standing Committee on Indigenous Involvement of the International Arctic Science Committee and editor of Settler Colonial Studies Journal.
This is Vadim and Hanna in the studio, and you are welcome to join us as we explore these rich insights and experiences Rauna brings from her research and advocacy for indigenous peoples.
In your academic career, you have been engaged with the developments of indigenous studies for a long time. In 2007, you published your first book called Reshaping the University. In this book, you argued that the epistemic foundations of the university as an institution are too narrow, despite claims that universities are places of knowledge. These narrow foundations are also exclusionary, neglecting and dismissing other ways of knowing. Later, you have also discussed how in academia it is often assumed that indigenous studies means anthropology. However, in fact, indigenous studies involve many other disciplines and different academic perspectives. And you actually yourself are focused on political studies, international relations. So a big question here is, what are, in your viewpoint, indigenous studies?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to join your podcast. Indigenous studies, I think there's a fairly broad consensus that Indigenous studies is its own discipline. It's an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field of study that involves many disciplines. I could draw so many disciplines, and there are a lot of researchers within Indigenous studies come from very diverse disciplinary and scholarly backgrounds. But there is this also kind of a fairly common misunderstanding that Indigenous studies is only about studying indigenous peoples. And as we know, as you mentioned, that has fallen traditionally within the field of anthropology. But Indigenous studies is a kind of interdisciplinary field with its own methods, methodology, theoretical and epistemological assumptions. And they relate to what you referred to, what I was critiquing in my Reshaping the University book, that the kind of epistemology is relational understanding of the world and epistemologies that stem from the understanding. So they form the foundation of Indigenous studies theoretical and methodological framework. Indigenous studies have been around. They began developing first in the United States in the early 70s as the result of the civil rights movements, Indigenous women's Black rights movement. There was the American Indian movement that came about largely from the academia and from the narrow foundations like ethnic studies and anthropology, and this claim and desire to create space for Indigenous studies. and it has evolved into very broad fields where there are similar subfields, similar disagreements that any and conversations about the direction and the kind of key issues that any discipline has. And most recently, it has that there is this subfield called critical Indigenous studies that has also increasingly incorporates kind of critical analysis of, well, I guess perhaps most closely to my own research as well, Indigenous and state relations and Indigenous and settler colonial relations.
You are from the Otsejohka, Utsjoki in Finnish. So this is part of the broader transboundary Sami, the Sami homeland, basically, that mostly lies north of the Arctic Circle. So in general terms, could you discuss a little bit what kind of critical edge is Sami today? What are kind of the main challenges and developments that you consider affecting the Sami territory and well, perhaps also like how that relates to your own research within the Indigenous studies?
Sápmi today indeed is very much a critical edge, also because of the global desire for critical minerals. We know the Critical Raw Minerals Act that was passed last year at the EU level, and the energy transition. All the eyes are looking at the Arctic now. European Arctic in particular. Europe wants to be self-sufficient, break dependency from Chinese critical minerals. So the assumption is that the Sami territory is kind of like a vast, almost you could argue going back to the idea of colonies, like it's the resource colony where Europe can extract its minerals for the energy transition. So there's this in the past 5 years, perhaps a decade, but more rapidly even the past few years, the increase and the pressure of various energy transition initiatives, not only mining, but also expansion of hydro development, wind industry in particular, not so much in Finland yet, but certainly a very big issue in other parts of Sápmi. So there is this kind of conflict and the huge push for especially wind energy development, which is very area intensive. Like you have to, there are massive turbines, and the wind energy complexes are massive. They are like over 100 turbines. So it's that combined with the road and the line infrastructure, it's very huge. So it puts huge pressure on Sami society, particularly Sami reindeer herding.
You have recently written and spoken about the case of Deatnu River, and this river is located at the heart of the Sami land. And this river is often regarded as one of the finest salmon river in Europe. It is one of the oldest actually political borders in Europe, created by the 1751 peace accord between Norway and then Sweden. And actually this border later became the Finnish Norwegian border. Could you tell us more a little bit about the meaning of the Deatnu River for the Sami people? What is the history related to this? How it has affected the Sami people, especially prior to the Second World War, but also after that. So the situation has changed to our knowledge. So could you tell us more about this river?
Indeed, it's a home river for me and for people living along the river, but also there is the invisible border that goes in the middle. Myself, like others, have family on both sides of the river, so it really, you don't feel the border in your daily life, and this certainly was the case for a long time after the establishment of the border that you mentioned in 1751, and the life continued very much as it had been until perhaps before the war, and especially it was felt more strongly after the war, when basically it was like the political tensions, the Iron Curtain, and those kind of tensions were felt on both sides. And there was a short period when the Sami were required to carry a kind of like a piece of document if they wanted to cross the river anywhere else other than the border crossing, the formal, the official border crossings. But for a long time, people have been fishing there together, the villages on both sides of the river. The border was established in 1751. 100 years later, the first Deatnu Agreement was established. This is the kind of agreement between Norway and Finland, how to govern the river, the salmon fishing in particular in that river. So it was like this kind of bilateral agreement, but also to start gradually controlling the traditional Sami salmon fisheries along the river. And of course, people along that river, many of them are not reindeer herders, but they are the fish. They get their livelihoods. They are the river people, like in the Sami. We call them the river people, the river Sami, or the valley people, and they are very much, their identities are formed through the river, the fact that they are able to go fishing salmon. And we know that the most recent Deatnu Agreement was negotiated and agreed in 2017, which closed salmon fisheries altogether for everyone in Deatnu, which was a huge blow for the people along the river on multiple grounds, in terms of livelihood, income, but also the mental impact has been huge, like the psychological impact, that you cannot go to what you've been doing all your life. You cannot transmit the knowledge, the language related to that salmon fisheries practices to the next generations, but also the kind of connection that people have inherited and created, acquired through their lives. Suddenly it's gone, like, and the river is empty. Like, even the fact that you see that there are no boats, nobody's fishing, it feels a huge loss. And this is what I discuss in the article that you mentioned, that it's these gradual closures that began in the mid 19th century have gradually restricted, slowly but surely, the traditional Sami fisheries, to a point that now nobody can fish. Last year, and this is, I was just listening to the news this morning, and they said that the news is that due to the very steep decline of salmon, continued decline of salmon stocks in the river, the fisheries is closed this year as well. So it means that this kind of like, there will be a generation soon that hasn't been able to go to the river. So yes, it has been for centuries. It was one of the finest and greatest salmon rivers in Europe, but now there's no more salmon. Like, the salmon is not returning, and people can't really agree on what the reason is. The state and some researchers like to suggest that it's overfishing, but it's clear that the numbers, well, it depends on whose numbers and what numbers you look at, but it's not possible to pinpoint to one factor. Climate change, we know salmon, warmer waters is harmful for salmon. The massive increase of salmon farming, aquaculture along the coast of Norway, all this has an impact. So, but still, we are in the situation that the greatest salmon river, there's no salmon and people can't fish. So it's really a kind of local crisis in many ways.
Yes, to make sure, in this river we don't have dams, right?
No, there are no dams.
So then, you are saying that more or less until the end of World Wars, well, this river was culturally important and in a way still pertaining to a context where the Sami people also perhaps were more in communication with Norway and towards that area, and rather than to the rest of Finland. But do you see that changed also after the world wars? And I'm also thinking, I don't know, how do they define the border in the river? I mean, because in international rivers, you've got a couple of different ways of defining the border. Also, I would like to ask about this development with the Deatnu Agreement. How does that relate to conservation and conservationists, and how has that situation with salmon conservationists developed also in that context? So, well, many questions, but
yeah, the Deatnu, it really is. You can feel that the closest relations are to the other side of the river and then northward, because there's a long tradition of the Deatnu salmon Sami going to the bigger towns on the Norwegian coast where they would trade their fish. So the trade routes and communication routes were very much to the coastal Sápmi, which is now northern Norway. So it was kind of isolated from the rest of the Finland. And for instance, there was a healthcare center on the Finnish side, not far from where my home place is, which treated patients from the both sides of the river. So it was really like a community of its own. But then the border after the war, it was more intensely patrolled, and this was before the war, where people had to decide, like if they had, say, a summer place on the Norwegian side and the winter place, like say for their cows or sheep fields. So they had to decide which side they are going to settle. So hence, what will be their citizenship, which had obviously far-reaching consequences. But if I move on to your other question about conservation and the salmon, traditional Sami salmon fisheries, there has been a long history of tension there, as elsewhere, that this idea of, and it's similar to reindeer herding as well, this idea that the state knows better how to conserve and how to manage, how to govern a natural resource than the local people who have governed it for thousands of years. Sami historians who have studied this say that Sami have governed successfully the salmon and the salmon species and salmon fisheries for centuries. And then now the government comes, both governments, Norway and Finland, come and say that the declining salmon or the collapse of the salmon stocks is because you have overfished. It's kind of ludicrous and obviously creates tension. So this kind of finger pointing to, and we know that if your livelihood depends on a resource, you make sure that you don't overharvest it. This is not to romanticize the fact that there has been, Deatnu is a long river. So there has been also tensions along the river that this kind of, I'd say, fairly typical disagreements that the ones on the headwaters saying that people below overfish. They fish too much, so not enough salmon comes to the upstream or the tributaries. So there's those tensions, and they still are.
I think that's interesting, and also because you have been in terms of this case, you have been talking about the kind of figurative wall. I mean, we've got the actual international border there, and now you have been showing that in terms of these developments with the Deatnu Agreement, it's a bit like putting a figurative wall as well. That is not, well, it's political, but it's also obviously cultural, that affects the self-determination and the cultural and Sami rights for fishing, right? So it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about that, and also related to this, you have been connecting this to the Nordic settler colonialism. So if you could explain a little bit like those links as well.
Yeah, about that figurative wall, and I realized I forgot your second question earlier about how the border is defined in Deatnu. It's where the river is the deepest, where the deepest part of the river goes, and obviously that shifts annually. But with the Deatnu Agreement and the ban of salmon fisheries along Deatnu, I argue that the figurative walls are also now on the banks of the river that bar people going for fishing. Obviously, there are people who continue fishing, and then the question is this poaching? Is it illegal? Like, this is the argument that has been put forward within Indigenous studies elsewhere in the Arctic, perhaps Arctic Indigenous research, particularly in similar cases in Alaska and in the Canadian Arctic, that how states criminalize Indigenous ways of life. And this is directly comparable to that and relates to the question of Nordic settler colonial presence, that colonialism is very much in the contemporary structures. It's not something that happened in the past, but continues today. Ellos Deatnu was a movement that emerged in the wake of that 2017 Deatnu Agreement to reclaim the river and reclaim the governance of Deatnu and the Sami governance, and show that the locals can and should be in charge of dispensing permits. And part of that movement was to declare a moratorium around a small island in the Deatnu River just outside Ohtseohka, Utsjoki town. The moratorium declared that the state laws pertaining to salmon fisheries don't apply within the waters of that island. And if people want to fish, then some fisheries was permitted. But if somebody wanted to fish in those waters, the permits, you need to ask the permission of the local people around that island who live, whose traditional fishing areas those are. So it was a kind of like a new approach to resist this agreement and the new regulations. The people who involved in Ellos Deatnu set up a camp on that same island. It was Kärretsuolu, the Arctic tern island. If you look at the logo, it's this beautiful illustration of an Arctic tern. That was a time when some fisheries were still allowed. Nobody could foresee in 2017 that there will be, like, this is the 5th year now when the fisheries ban is in force. So the question now is how to move forward when the native salmon stocks have collapsed, and now there's the invasion of new species, the very aggressive pink salmon.
Well, one thing would be perhaps interesting to hear a little bit is how this resistance is part of the broader Sami resistances or struggles or movements that are currently taking place that are quite related to natural resources and these kind of questions as well. And then for those who listen and perhaps are not familiar with the Sami, to know about the Deatnu River, to what extent are the river sides colonized? I mean, like populated, like how many communities are there in the riverside along this river, or is it more like a natural environment, or how does it look like alongside the river? How is the landscape?
Well, for somebody from that part of the world, well, this is not only my opinion. Many others who are not from that part all say that it's one of the most beautiful valleys that they know, and it's rolling hills. It's sparsely populated, small villages mostly. There are some larger towns like Ohtsejohka is one, and then Deatnu other down the river in the Norwegian side, Karjasjärka, Karasjohka. They are along the tributary Aanarjohka, but up until recently, the population have been mostly Sami. I guess after the war, I'd say when the road came in the early 70s to the, if I'm thinking of the Finnish side of the valley, the road was built. There's actually a Sami song that roads both bring and they take. And one of the impacts that what they brought was this influx of Finnish sports fishers. So what you now see along the Deatnu Valley also, especially and particularly on the Finnish side, are these cabins all the way. They are on the banks, they are along the hills, they are on the top of the hills. Then if you go walk along, what I was doing last summer, walking along a tributary not far from my own Fierranjohka, a slightly bigger one, and I was shocked to see how like also the small tributaries are dotted by these cabins, like they are everywhere. So yeah, I guess you can say that that's kind of also colonization by construction and taking over, like this kind of well-known phenomenon from other parts of the indigenous world, this kind of fragmentation of indigenous territories, like people sell. And obviously, they are the Sami themselves who have inherited the farmlands, and some decide to sell their shares, at least parts of it, and so it really becomes fragmented. And in that agreement, the 2017 Deatnu Agreement, what was most striking, especially for the locals, was that the disproportionate reduction of Sami traditional fisheries compared to the sports fisheries. The sports fisheries was slightly increased in that agreement, or that that regulation. So yeah, those are just a few examples that kind of indicate how the settler colonial structures seek to eliminate or replace indigenous peoples, and they, if not physically, then replace their knowledge, their governance practices, the skills, language, etc. But there's really, like, if you go back to your question about the other indigenous or Sami struggles and resistance, Ellos Deatnu certainly was inspired by the Standing Rock movement in the US, in North Dakota, against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And some of the Sami who were in the Ellos Deatnu, they also went to that Standing Rock camp. And so there is this also kind of global indigenous solidarity. And now, most recently, we see that post-Fosen decision, the demonstrations in Oslo that were taking place 2 years ago to basically call attention to the fact that Norwegian government is not respecting to its own Supreme Court's decision. It was a decision that surprised everybody when it unanimously held that the Fosen, the South Sami region of Fosenjärka, it's the Fosen Peninsula is near Trondheim in Norway, that the 150 turbine wind industry complex violates the human rights of Sami reindeer herders of the area. And it took, what was it, 2 years before the government of Norway started actually doing something. I argue that this is a kind of settler colonial strategy that Like now with the Strategic Mineral Act, the EU, if you identify a project as strategic, then it's the permitting process is accelerating. So on the one hand, there's this speeding up certain processes, but then on the other hand, there's these delays and dragging your feet, and when it comes to upholding indigenous rights.
Well, we approach this topic of the political issue here, which is clearly related to the problem of indigenous self-determination. And you have discussed in your recent publications, your recent publications actually revolving around this problem that remains largely unresolved in many lands of indigenous people, including Finland. So I wonder, what are the current political constraints to exercise the self-determination right the Sami people encounter in Finland?
It goes back to the refusal to recognize Sami rights to their territories, because you cannot really exercise indigenous self-determination without some kind of authority or jurisdiction or decision-making powers over a territory. Like in Finland, the problem is that Sami self-determination, so-called, is reduced to cultural autonomy, which I argue reduces Sami as an indigenous people to a cultural minority. Like Sami self-determination is framed in terms of right to language and culture. And there was a development in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a more comprehensive legislation called the Sami Act, which included, on the one hand, the establishment, the Sami parliament, and then also addressing the question of Sami land rights. The proposal was fairly laudable in the sense that it proposed to return the lands that were so-called considered state land, so not private land, but the state land, to the local siitas, the Sami governing units. But there was such a strong opposition, both nationally and locally and regionally, so that the government backed out and decided that we're only going to move forward with the governance piece of the part of the legislation, which then became the Act on the Sami Parliament and the Sami Cultural Autonomy Act. So it's very much like it's constrained to a point that Sami, and even within the Sami Parliament as it currently functions, the Sami don't have authority to make decisions over affairs that impact them or deal with them. They're only allowed to issue statements or make initiatives. They can send their representatives to various bodies where they have one voice, so it doesn't amount to much. So that there is no decision-making authority in Sami self-determination. You could argue that maybe in Norway the authority is slightly greater, but in my view, Sami self-determination today is not more than self-administration, that you can administer your affairs to a point, you can administer the funds that you receive annually from the state, but that's it.
Well, in the recent weeks, we observed that Greenland suddenly appeared in the center of world politics. And we know that you have studied this right of or the issue of self-determination of Inuit people in Greenland. And what are your view of what is happening there and how their rights will be now positioned in all these radical changes that which are happening around this land?
Greenland is such a fascinating case when you consider indigenous self-determination, because it takes you to it muddies, it's kind of like, it shows the complexity of indigenous self-determination. I was there soon after the 2009 self-determination agreement and then the law that they negotiated with Denmark, the Greenlanders. In 2013, doing my research, which I write about in my 2019 book, Restructuring Relations. And there's been this long-standing desire for full independence from Denmark since the early 70s. Like there are premiers who have said that independence is ingrained in the Inuit soul or Greenlander's soul. So there is this 50-year-old independence movement that they want to become an independent nation. But the nation that they want to become is really a kind of like a Western nation state. Like this is what they are aiming for, at least the politicians in Nuuk, in the capital of Nuuk. So the question is then, like, it's almost 90% of the population of Greenland are Inuit Greenlanders. So if this becomes an independent state, is it an indigenous state, nation state, with similar political institutions, the way it functions than any other European nation state or Western state, or is it then something different? These debates are ongoing, obviously. Like not everybody agree that this is where I know that from the conversations that I had that not everybody agrees to this direction. But also it's the fact that if go back to what we were talking about earlier, climate change, that why everybody's suddenly interested in Greenland. Well, partly it is because of the strategic minerals, the raw earth metals and minerals. When I was in Greenland in 2013, they just elected their first female premier who was very business oriented and wanted to, she basically said to Alec Hammond that Greenland is for sale and we have mountains of gold and uranium, you name it, we are open for the world to come and do business with us, because it's clear that if Greenland wants to become independent, they also need to fund their independence. Denmark won't be sending their annual transfers anymore. So the question then is that, are you trading your political independence to an economic dependence on these multinational corporations? Because Greenland is covered in ice, but now it's melting. So the minerals and the resources become more easily available. And of course, now with the also military tensions growing, intensifying by day almost. So it's very strategic also, Greenland. You look at the Arctic and everybody, China and the US and everybody's vying for the kind of military leadership in the Arctic. So that's why the US now wants to claim Greenland. But the election results, like they had recently elections there, and it was very surprising how the moderates then Democratic, who have been in the minority forever, a very small party so far, and suddenly they win a landslide. So it's also telling how there is this desire for stability as well.
You actually approach in your discussion about the Greenlanders and their desire for establishing a nation state, kind of a traditional nation state, which used to be kind of the dominant model of organizing or ordering the social relations in international relations in general. So I actually have a question related to that. So how should we distinguish between the right or the indigenous self-determination and actually this potential for nationalism, which some communities might have in terms of their fight for independence?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that was very much debated when the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was negotiated and then finally adopted in 2007. But it was like 20 years of intense negotiations, and the question was that, can we include the mention of or the idea of self-determination in the declaration, because then it means all indigenous peoples suddenly want to become independent. And it took decades of persuasion that by indigenous representatives globally, that indigenous self-determination doesn't mean independence, political independence or separation, though there are those exceptions, and Greenland is one of them. So this is what I was referring to, that kind of how Greenland is one example that complicates this notion of indigenous self-determination. But by far, you could say over 90% of indigenous peoples are not interested in, are not talking about full political independence or separation. They have no means, they have no interest. What indigenous self-determination basically means, and this is as it's expressed in there is the Article 3 in UNDRIP that is similar to the other UN human rights conventions that say all peoples have right to self-determination. UNDRIP says indigenous peoples have right to self-determination, but then Articles 4 and 5 kind of modify or clarify this right, saying that what it means in practice, that indigenous peoples have internally autonomy to authority decision making over their own affairs, and then the other side of the coin is that they have right to participate in the affairs and the social life of the broader society, so that they are not kind of excluded from the society within which the nation state within which they live and exist.
What is the future of indigenous studies? What is the future of many indigenous communities across the world, including the Sami people? What are these critical edges? How they are going to change, transform, or preserve certain specificities which we have at the moment? So how do you view the future of these critical edges?
One critical edge is as this has been said by Rose Bird, if I remember correctly, that the most powerful act by indigenous peoples is to stay in place. This idea that by staying where you are, staying home basically, is the most radical. It is the resistance, that you are not removed, you are not eliminated, you are not replaced. Personally, I think that the critical edge of future indigenous studies is certainly feminist. That's something that we didn't have a chance to touch upon, but how I have framed and looked at indigenous self-determination, for instance, that we do need to look at also the relations that are not necessarily supportive or sustaining, the relations of domination, if we want to attain full and proper self-determination. That we also, and we do need that kind of the analysis, indigenous feminist analysis, to understand those relations. And my critical edge is, I guess, I recently wrote a piece in which I theorize indigenous feminist relational freedom that emphasizes the fact that the relations, how the kind of the relational structures of domination impact women and gender diverse people, and how we also need to kind of like, there's this in international relations, there has been this relational turn, and then we also talked about the indigenous relational turn and the emphasis of indigenous relationality. Sometimes it's discussed in a kind of superficial or shallow ways, that we only talk about the good relations. But I think we also need to look at all relations. So in this piece that I consider my current critical edge is that we need to look at all our relations, that critique the kind of conventional framing of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination only through a relation of non-interference. That obviously indigenous people require non-interference and autonomy from state intervention. But then what are the kind of the deeper aspects of indigenous freedom? So I kind of theorize this indigenous feminist relational freedom, drawing on feminist relational autonomy, citizenship, and indigenous gift relations, and how they can be informing this understanding of indigenous feminist relational freedom into the future.
Thank you for listening to the Critical Edges podcast. We are Hanna Laako, Vadim Romashov, Eleonora Karttunen, and Catherine Hall, researchers at the University of Eastern Finland who explore and inhabit many critical edges.
This podcast is made possible by the Kone Foundation and the Borders, Mobilities and Culture Encounters research community of the University of Eastern Finland.